Hey everyone, welcome to Amanda's Book Corner. I'm Amanda, and this is my review of 400 Souls, a community of African America from 1619 to 2019, edited by Ibram x Kendi and Keisha and Blain. This book came out about a year ago, and I've been planning to read it ever since I got it. I decided that February was a perfect time to read it. I listened to the audiobook throughout all of February, which is Black History Month, and it's a really great way to get a broad look at African American history for the 400 years that African American people have been here. So this book covers the entire 400-year history from the time the first African people arrived in what is now the United States up through 2019. It's divided up into 5-year sections, and so there are 80 different chapters, each covering a 5-year span from 1619 through 2019. And in addition to those 80 chapters, there's also a foreword and an afterword, as well as 10 poems. Each chapter and poem is written by a different author or contributor, and so there were a lot of people attached to this that I have already read before. The reason I first knew about this book and got it is because of Ibram x Kendi. I read his book How to Be Anti-Racist 2 years ago, and there are also a lot of other authors in here that I have read. I read, for example, Isabel Wilkerson, Ijeoma Oluo, Alicia Garza, and so I was really excited to read this book, or in this case listen to the audiobook specifically, and really get different views of many different themes and points of history throughout the last 400 years. So this is not a comprehensive history of everything that's happened in the last 400 years, and indeed it doesn't touch on every event that even I'm aware of specifically. Instead, each of the 80 chapters highlights a different event in history, or a different person in history, or a different theme that's relevant to that time, but also to present day. Some chapters are about specific pieces of legislature that were passed, some are about specific events, some are about specific people, some more well-known and some less well-known. And the way these chapters are presented has a lot of diversity as well. Some are more heavily researched than others and have a lot of historical references. Some are a little bit more personal in nature and have relation or connection to events that are relevant in present day or to the authors in their lives right now. Some of them even come across as a sort of fictionalization of a certain person. So some chapters that are about a specific person in history, they're written as a first-person narrative, as if that person had written down a memoir or a diary entry. And I think that was really interesting, getting these very different styles and perspectives, mostly more nonfiction, but some that feel a little bit more fictionalized as well. So I thought that was really interesting. And it kept the book from getting stagnant or too consistent in style. So I did actually like that. I will say that I'm not an expert in African American history or in history in general. I didn't major in history or anything. But I noticed that the farther back in time it was, when it starts off in 1619 and going through the 16 and 1700s, I felt like I was a lot less aware of that history already. And so I felt like it was a lot more learning that was going on my part. And it was a little bit harder for me to situate myself in those chapters, but I did find them very illuminating. But as we move forward in time and into the 1800s and especially into the 1900s and today, I really found myself feeling more and more comfortable in terms of my foundational knowledge of specific events and themes. And so with those ones, because I had more foundational knowledge just because of what I learned in my history classes and in college, and more recently actually, I felt like those ones I was more aware of things, and so I was learning different things in a different way, but I was also expecting different things that may or may not have been delivered. So I did mention, for example, that they have a lot of chapters about specific people in history, but they're not always the people that you expect to see. There were no chapters on Harriet Tubman or Martin Luther King. Instead, there were a lot of chapters about people that are maybe a little bit under the radar or not talked about as much or as prevalently. I also really liked that the chapters go into a lot of different directions. Of course, there's a lot of chapters that are about the atrocities that white people have committed against African American and Black people throughout history, including slavery and the many types of different legislature that white people continue to pass in order to keep Black people subjugated and enslaved and powerless. So that was really eye-opening and horrible, honestly. But especially as we move forward, there's also a lot of lighter things and more empowering moments as well. For example, I really like this one chapter that was on LGBTQ plus people among African Americans in history. I thought that was really fascinating. And I also liked how the author connected it to different parts of Africa and their different views on queer identities. I liked some chapters that talked about, for example, the Harlem Renaissance and the different kinds of writers and poets and musicians that came up out of that time in the early 20th century. I thought that was a really great chapter. Later on, there was a chapter on hip-hop that I found really fascinating. And starting there is when I started to see more chapters that I'm very intimately aware of, because these are things that happened in my lifetime. So I know about Anita Hill. I remember the war on drugs, and I know how that really was targeted against African American people. I remember Hurricane Katrina, and I'm very aware of the police brutality that we see against African American people to this day. And it talked about Black Lives Matter. And so there's a lot of things, especially at the very end of this book, that weren't so much new learnings for me, but they're reiterating things that I keep seeing and hearing about in our present day in the news and in modern books and media that we're seeing. So this is at once a history lesson, but also a lesson of what's continuing to affect African American people to this day. You can see through a lot of the chapters the connections between the past and how relevant those themes still are to this day. So I thought that was really powerful and a very interesting way to see how a lot has changed over the years, but also not enough has changed. Because there were 80 different chapters, there's a lot to take in here, and I actually think that this is the kind of book that I would like to reread in the future. I feel like the more I read it and listen to it, the more things will start to sink in and I'll start to internalize them. Also, I think a really important thing to note about this book is that because each of these chapters is only maybe 10 minutes long, I listen to the audiobooks, I measure it in time, but because each of the chapters is fairly short, they really are not comprehensive about anything. Rather, I think this is a really great way to look at these chapters as a springboard to find new topics and themes and pieces of history and people in history, and go out and find more information about them. A lot of these chapters are things that definitely have full-length books available. And so I think that this collection of essays really serves as a way to open your mind to different things and as a starting point for a lot of different learning that you can do. I did mention the Harlem Renaissance, for example. That's something that I'd like to learn about more thoroughly and read full-length books about that specific theme. There's also specific people that I'd like to learn more about. One chapter is about Malcolm X, and of course I know who he is, but I haven't read any books that are specifically about him. And so I know that there's a lot of those available as well. So I thought this was a really excellent book and very well done and very ambitious, and I couldn't help but think while I was listening to it, like, how did they organize all of this? How did they decide who would write about what time in history and also who would write about what event or theme in history? So I thought it was really fascinating, and again, this is a great starting point if you want to learn more about the many different facets of African American history and politics and cultural identity and things that affect them to this day. I definitely recommend this book to everyone, regardless of your race or your identity. I think this book is very eye-opening, and I think that if more people read it, it'll make people more understanding of African American history and what affects them to this day, and more empathetic, and I think it's just something that we can all benefit from reading. So all in all, I gave 400 Souls 5 stars. I hope you enjoyed this book review video. If you did, please like, comment, and subscribe. And to make sure you don't miss any more of my videos, please ring the bell to get all my notifications. I put out about 2 to 3 book review videos like this one every week, as well as 1 to 2 other videos like listicles and vlogs. So thanks for watching this video, and I hope to see you in the next one. Bye!